Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is a TELedvisors SIG webinar. This is our monthly webinar. We are talking today about the value of recognition programs, and with a particular focus on the PSF, the Professional Standards Framework, which used to be the UK PSF, and it has undergone some changes, which will come into effect later on this year. And so, so we've got Professor Abby Cathcart to talk to us about that. Before we do, I will acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which from which I'm presenting today, which are the Yagara and Turrbal people in Meanjin, Brisbane, on the banks of Maiwar, the Brisbane River. It's interesting to talk about accreditation and recognition programs, because it is about recognizing knowledge, and it is also about recognizing knowledge holders, which is quite relevant to what we are talking about today. And there are all sorts of different rules in different cultural contexts about that. So I will not dribble on for too long, so I'll introduce Abby. Professor Abby Cathcart is the director of QUT Academy of Learning and Teaching. She's currently also the director of the Learning and Teaching Unit, at acting director at QUT, and she's a professor of higher education and governance. She's a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and she leads Advance HE HEA Australasian Accredited Leaders Network, which has been instrumental in representing Australian perspectives in the revision of the Professional Standards Framework. Abby's had a long-term involvement with this anyway, and she's been fairly instrumental nationally in Australia to bring the Professional Standards Framework to Australia and spread the word. So yeah, and she's also my boss. So I'll I'll stop sharing. And so can you share from your end, Abby?
I can. Thank you. Thanks. Right. Thanks. I should also add, I didn't write my own introduction there. Hank was making that up. So I'm really thrilled to have a chance to talk to you about this, and really grateful for the opportunity. I do think this is an exciting time for our sector more broadly. So I'm going to talk about the role of recognition a little bit in a more abstract way, and then the Professional Standards Framework specifically, but in the opposite order. And I should acknowledge as well at the beginning that I am a strategic advisor to Advance HE. So as Hank said, I chair the Programme Leader Network in Australasia. And I also chair the group of Australasian accreditors who work for Advance HE. So I've got kind of two hats on, my QUT hat and that one as well. I'd like to add my acknowledgement of country as well. I'd also particularly like to pay respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants. I'm also, as Henk is, on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yagara people, lands that were never ceded. And I also want to just acknowledge that this is a very difficult period for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students in the lead up to the referendum. Okay, so a little mini history tour. The Professional Standards Framework, as Henk said, was created in the UK by the UK sector in response to a government report, really, which was looking at the professionalisation of university teaching. And it led to a decision to create a Professional Standards Framework, which was then given to the Higher Education Academy, effectively to serve as custodians of. The Professional Standards Framework then and now underpins the HEA Fellowship scheme. So they're separate but connected things. And the first Professional Standards Framework was published in 2011. As much as I would love to claim I brought this to Australia, colleagues at ANU would have very different views on that. So ANU was the first Australian university that accredited with Advance HE, and my university copied shortly afterwards. We have recently just launched the new version of the professional standards framework, and that was created following a significant consultation internationally. In particular, there was widespread consultation in New Zealand and Australia, because as you'll see in a moment, we are two of the biggest stakeholders outside of the UK. It's also worth being clear that there was an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff roundtable that very much informed the final product as part of that process. Advance HE is a not-for-profit entity. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the organisation, they were formed through the merger of the Higher Education Academy, the Leadership Foundation, and the Gender Equity Association that runs Athena Swan in the UK. It's a not-for-profit, and it is based on a membership model, and the member is an institution and an individual. So I can talk a little bit about that maybe in the questions. There's been this rapid growth in engagement with this scheme, and I would say HEA Fellowship now absolutely dominates the landscape internationally for professional recognition for staff in support for learning or teaching roles. So there's just over 170,000 members, fellows globally. They are one of 4 core categories of fellowship, from associate fellow through to principal fellow. So associate fellow is often seen as an emerging engagement with the framework, through to principal fellow, which is about demonstrating strategic leadership in relation to the framework. As I said earlier, there's been this huge international engagement. I think it really began with Australia, but it has then rolled out to many other countries. So Thailand, for example, there are a number of Thai universities that are fully accredited. There's many others which are supporting staff to apply for fellowship directly to Advance HE, but have not yet accredited their own schemes. We've also seen growth through United Arab Emirates, New Zealand and Saudi. There's a small number of European, non-UK European members, and there's quite a large membership in the Irish Republic. And really, and I should say, quite high levels of membership in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. And as you can see, this is something which has just steadily grown, in particular over the last few years. I'll maybe return to the Associate Fellow Indigenous Award, because that is an award that was only created by our university, by Queensland University of Technology, specifically for staff members who can demonstrate the effective integration of Indigenous perspectives into their educational practice. So the numbers for that are relatively small, though we're seeing others engage. All right, so I'm now going to just talk about the changes to the professional standards framework. I'm very happy to answer further questions in relation to that as we go through. Okay, so the new professional standards framework launched about a month ago internationally. It's been available to the sector since January, but applications have only just started to come through. And the key changes that have been made include a much stronger focus on inclusion in all its forms. I think a strong commitment to ensuring that the framework is accessible to third space professionals. So the idea being that there's recognition that between 2011 and now, there's been significant changes to the way that our universities engage with support for teaching and students. and that the new framework needed to recognise the many staff working in third space or professional roles who have key roles which are connecting to this professionalisation of support for learning and teaching. One of the other key areas of emphasis, and this is one that I absolutely attribute to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consultation as part of the review of the standards framework, was a new focus on context, recognising that it's really important that applicants are able to contextualise their claim for recognition in the light of the kinds of work that they're doing, which is of course shaped by the kinds of institutions that they're working in, the kinds of roles that they are employed to do, but also the national cultural context, including the country in which they are undertaking that work. So this strong focus on context throughout. There's been also additional engagement with digital, a wider focus on collaboration, recognizing that very few of us do our work in isolation anymore. And finally, the idea of critical evaluation as being central to professional practice in any of our roles within the sector. Meanwhile, there are 4 descriptors. So the framework is made up of categories of dimensions of practice, which are then shaped as descriptors. And Henk, it might be handy if you can find the Advance HE link and just put that in the chat so people could actually open up a copy of PSF 23 as I'm talking.
All right, will do.
Thank you. So the dimensions that underpin this framework articulate the professional values that are the foundation of all our practice, the core knowledge, what it is that people who are in support for learning or educator roles need to demonstrate they know to underpin that practice, and finally the areas of activity, the activities that we do to support the delivery of effective practice across our institutions. If I can give a couple of examples of key changes here, I think that might help explain. But one of the things that I would say about the new framework is the language is designed to take a very broad view of what it is to work within a university, within a support for learning or a teaching role. So the professional standards framework that underpins the fellowship scheme has these dimensions, areas of activity, core knowledge and professional values. And as you can see by the language, they're explicitly designed now with the new professional standards framework to be applicable to a very wide range of staff and students working within a higher education sector in broad support for learning or teaching roles. The categories of fellowship range from associate fellow to principal fellow, as I've said. And as you can see, all of these categories, this is an example of the descriptor for associate fellow. It's drawing on that same dimensions of practice list that I just showed you. So associate fellow is about evidencing some of the dimensions. Again, you have to demonstrate effectiveness, but it can be in a fairly narrow way in relation to values, core knowledge, and areas of activity. Fellow takes a broader stance. So fellowship is about showing that broad-based effectiveness of practice, which is about showing that you can be effective in relation to all areas, all professional values, and that core knowledge. Senior fellow is quite interesting, and I'm aware that some of you have already engaged with this scheme and in fact are senior fellows of the HEA, and the changes that have been made to the descriptor here, I think, are making much clearer to participants, to applicants, that senior fellowship is about leadership, which is why they have framed the understanding around effective practice as a basis through which you then support, lead, and influence others within the university context. And then finally, principal fellow, which is about a sustained record of strategic leadership, usually across the institution or across a discipline, or across a profession. And again, the language that's been used to describe this descriptor is very much about saying this isn't just for the old school, directors of learning and teaching units. It's thinking about who has that strategic influence more broadly and how can they use that to make a claim based on their work, for example, through organizations like this, nationally and internationally. So there is detailed guides, all of which are available on the Advance HE website, which Hank's shared in the chat for people to go and have a look at. I think I just wanted to end by talking a little bit more about why I think this matters. And some of these ideas were very much the reason why I was so determined that my own university would become a member of Advance HE in order to offer this to staff. One of the most important ones for me is the idea that recognition helps create your sense of membership of a community of people who have got some shared endeavors. And I think that's particularly important in institutions like ours that have got academic staff, professional staff, sessional staff, student partners, all of whom are working in various aspects of support for learning or teaching, and all of whom are going to be far more effective in their roles if they feel a sense of joint endeavor in achieving the objectives. So I think that sense of belonging is incredibly important. And I should say it's also well supported in some of the scholarly literature, which has been used to evaluate various approaches to embedding professional standards frameworks and fellowship schemes. The second one is a sense of self-efficacy. And again, this is drawing on some of my own research, which was with early career academics internationally, and with PhD students who are starting to teach in a couple of different countries. And we found very clearly that fellowship underpinned by the standards framework helped build confidence that they had the capacity to support learning and to deal with the kind of challenges that you encounter when you attempt to support learning. For many staff, choosing to apply for recognition as a fellow is actually one of the first times that they have engaged with the scholarly literature. And one of the things that I know we're all trying to drive across Australia and New Zealand is evidence-based practice. I'm really pleased to see in the new professional standards framework, there's a broader understanding of what that evidence base might look like. And that includes a whole range of blogs, reports, professional forums like this, as well as some of the more traditional scholarly outputs like journals and books. Reflective practice, I think, is the absolute heart. You need to write reflectively and critically about your practice in order to make a claim for recognition. And we know that the act of reflecting on practice can enhance our approaches to practice. So I think that's a really fundamental part of it. And then finally, what we've seen across the UK in particular, but grow in an increasing way also across Australia and New Zealand, are universities seeking to connect their employment practices to the professional standards framework. That could be as simple for academic staff as having fellowship connected as an indicator for promotion or probation. But we've also seen it used very widely in universities who are looking at fellowship as a way of measuring performance for all staff and helping them see, how can I demonstrate that I'm moving into leadership and I'm moving into strategic leadership, fellowship being an important way of doing so. So I'd like to pause there. That was a very eventful presentation, and I hope some of it made sense despite the disruption. But I'll stop there and see if people would like to ask questions or have a wider discussion.
Yes, thanks so much, Abby. That was tremendous that you continue to be here. You were just, your final point there about employment practices. I'm wondering if you've seen any use, or if you think there might be a use for comparisons across universities. So does it serve as a benchmarking? I'm thinking particularly of the sort of recent trend towards merging institutions, and whether the level of PSF that we're looking at, whether that gives information to partner institutions.
Yeah, so I think this is an area that's used already very extensively in the UK. So members of Advance HE, institutional members, have to submit an annual report. They get all of their data in terms of who has achieved recognition, what category of recognition they've achieved, what category of staff they are in the UK. So whether they are classed as casual staff, academic staff, or professional staff. And then they get benchmarking data, both across the sector and against their mission group. So this is something that is coming to Australia. We have got the same access to that data, but at the moment, or until very recently, because the number of institutional schemes were relatively small, the benchmarking data wasn't particularly helpful. But that's now changing. The majority of Australian universities are members of Advance HE now, which means that there's significant opportunity for sharing across the sector and benchmarking what we are seeing in relation to the professional recognition of educators within the institution, compared to some of those other metrics which are looking at teaching quality, for example, through the student experience survey.
Thank you very much, Abby. That was really interesting. My question is really around professional staff and opportunities for professional staff who really see their roles in supporting teaching and learning as a career, not just as a job. So I'm just wondering about if you could perhaps just elaborate a little bit more on some of the key changes that you see in this revision that would, I guess, enable professional staff to apply for perhaps the first category of fellowship, because this seems to me to be one of the very few frameworks or standards that have that parity, equity, where professional staff can apply in the same way that an academic can apply. Because I'm quite interested in the professional identity of the role of learning designers and learning technologists. Thank you.
This is the dimensions of practice. Every category of fellowship connects to these dimensions. Associate fellows, which is often seen as this entry pathway, have to demonstrate some of this. Fellows have to demonstrate all of it. Senior fellows have to demonstrate all of this, plus clear evidence that you are leading and supporting others in relation to this work. And then principal is strategic. And so as Meredith says, I think recognition for professional staff is really one of the big drivers why changes were made to this framework, so that the language here is seen as much more inclusive of the diverse work that's being undertaken within our institutions, particularly in terms of support for learning. And I think for me, that is learning technologists, people working as curriculum in learning design more broadly. It's also librarians, it's student partners who might be participating in peer programs. So there's a whole range of professional staff who I think have got a place within this framework now. I think it can be seen as ours. And we've seen it. So I should say we have pushed the old professional standards framework, I think, to its absolute limits within many of our institutions. So within QUT, I was really proud of the fact that we had hundreds of professional staff who had achieved recognition, not just as a D1 associate fellow, though that's an important place for many people to begin, but also as senior fellows and principal fellows. And that's really recognizing that when you're looking at the words that are on the screen in front of you, this is what many of us are doing all the time, including leadership. So when you are working with a team on curriculum transformation, including digital transformation, my university, like many, has just implemented our new learning management system. It's our colleagues in the design studios, including learning technologists and people working as part of production teams, that have led much of that work, not just done the work, but led the work. And I think recognition for that is incredibly important. So I think that is one of the flexibilities of this framework. I know that one of your discussion items is the extent to which, or if you were designing your own scheme, what might it look like? And I should say, when I began considering a way of getting recognition for colleagues at my own university, I started with a sector scan of what was out there and what other models there were and what else we could do. And there was some talk in the sector at that time about Australia originally, and then it widened, creating its own scheme. I'm really glad we didn't. And I think one of the reasons I'm glad we didn't is one of the great joys of being part of the fellowship community through Advance HE is your capacity to connect with people all over the world that are in similar jobs or have got similar challenges. And I think that community aspect to it is just incredibly powerful, including for professional staff, many of whom we know are still in relatively precarious employment with short-term contracts. And what this gives you is a form of recognition that becomes a currency for you to easily demonstrate to others in the sector, this is the kind of work I have been doing, and here's the evidence of its quality because I've achieved recognition at this particular category. I hope that answers.
Thank you. That's great.
Abby, if I can just follow on with a question about, because you're talking about the recognition across, like, at a global level, but there's also elements of it that are very specifically local. And I'm, at QUT, for example, you've started Associate Fellow Indigenous. Are there plans to expand that across Australia, or is it already available across Australia?
So we're still piloting the Associate Fellow Indigenous program. It's run at our institution for 3 years. And about a year ago, we started offering it to colleagues at other universities in Australia. They come to, well, they don't actually physically come to QUT, but they undertake a development program called Indigenous Perspectives in Learning and Teaching, and then they apply for that recognition as an Associate Fellow Indigenous through QUT. I think we've had, I'm making these numbers up, but it's something like 30 non-QUT applicants for that over the last year. I know there's a big demand for it, and I would love to actually see that particular award owned by the sector rather than owned by a single institution. At the moment, I think we're still in pilot mode and discussion. So we're continuing to offer it externally and through something called QUTX, which runs QUT's outside programs. But I think it's under discussion for what the future might look from next year on. Certainly, there's a lot of interest from other universities.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions for Abby? Penny.
Just encouraging anybody who does have questions, you're not actually shut down. We can let you out of muted jail. But I also wanted to grab the chance to ask Abby about the collaboration value that's been added in this edition. And because we haven't got many examples of how people have responded to that criteria yet, but I'm wondering, yes, if you have particular hopes for what might come out in that value.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I think it was an omission in the original professional standards framework. And one of the things that I found, and I've worked with people across Australia and New Zealand as they've developed their fellowship applications. And one of the things I kept finding is people kept using the word we. You have similar conversations when you're helping people with promotion applications. People use we when they're writing about their practice, and the award is an individual award, and therefore it must be based on the work that you did. So I spent a lot of time saying to people, can you clarify your role within that team, for example? Here, I think what we're seeing is a really strong statement that to be effective, you have to be able to collaborate. And so we're looking for examples of the many ways in which people do that in their practice, whether it's collaborating with other professional staff, whether it's collaborating with other students who you're trying to run peer programs with, whether it's thinking about the relationship between academics and professional staff as part of effective collaboration. So I think it's a really important, and what that is, what are those reflections on what creates a collaboration that fundamentally is successful. So I think this will be a really great part of the new framework, and I'm very much looking forward to reading some.
Colin.
Hello. Yes, I had a quick question. Oh, I thought I'd turn my camera on. Hello. So I've actually just been through the senior fellow process, and that was rewarding. It's certainly a big chunk of work. So I have been paying pretty close attention to the various criteria. Probably the most significant change that I think I've noticed in the framework is, I think it might have been descriptor 4 or something, which was something to do with design learning environments, design digital learning environments. So that appears to have been removed now. I was just wondering if you had any insights into the reason for that change, and whether that's kind of believed to have been kind of merged with something else. I guess for me, as someone particularly with a focus on education technologies, I felt like that was something that I was able to speak to quite well. Yeah,
thanks, Colin. So I think that the change you're referring to was the old A4, area of activity number 4, was something like design an effective learning environment. And that's now been changed in terms of A2 has been expanded to teach or support learning through effective approaches and environments. But in addition, K4, one of the core knowledges, has also been rewritten to really emphasize the use of digital or other technologies. And I think what the attempt here is to recognize that support for learning happens within a context, and it's very difficult to disentangle the effectiveness of a learning environment from the actual act of supporting learning or teaching. So the idea is to connect those two together, but to strengthen the core knowledge that underpins that in relation to digital technology. Like all these things, there was an extensive consultation. I should tell you that, I think I had something like 10 big wishes, and I would say maybe 6 of them found their way into the final version. But, that's what happens when it's a global community with views from all over the world. I do feel what we have is stronger and more flexible than what we had previously.
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question from Lisa in the chat. Can you please tell me if CMOL can be a step up to HEA?
Now, others in the room may have intelligence on this. My understanding is that there was a discussion with Advance HE a couple of years ago, which was looking at a dual award. So aligning the recognition processes. But I truthfully cannot tell you what happened as a result of that. I know that there is overlap in some parts with those separate awards, and I certainly know plenty of people that have both, but I don't actually know whether it's an automatic partnership now, so that one leads to the other without additional fees or processes.
I can speak broadly about CMALT, having been through that process a little while ago and keeping an eye on things. It's actually the certified member of the Association of Learning Technology. So it's a UK-based accreditation. To be honest, I would probably be surprised if that had moved forward, because the ALT, they like you to basically pay to renew your certification every 2 or 3 years. And it can get up to $300 or $400. And I'll get off my own personal hobby horse here, 'cause I feel like that's a little bit ambitious. I think they are kind of different in that it's definitely got much more of a focus on the application of technologies. One of the probably one of the most challenging things that I found in working through the HEA process was actually being able to demonstrate A2 and A3, so teaching and supporting learning, and particularly assessing and giving feedback for learning. I fortunately have been involved in doing some staff PD in my current role, but most of the work that I do is informal workshops, training, evaluation of technologies, and whatever else. So as a learning technologist, particularly the HEA fellowship can be challenging on those levels. Now, I am aware that the HEA, well, Advanced HE, provides specific advice for people working in the third space about how they might address some of these things. But if you are considering going down this path, that can be one of the biggest things to actually consider. It's a challenge to evidence, but I think we actually have a large enough group of people who have been through this process now in the TELedvisors community. I would certainly encourage you to sort of raise those questions, and I think people would be very helpful if you're in teams.
Thanks, Colin. I'd just add to that there's great resources now on the Advance HE website. So, for example, assess and give feedback for learning is about, could be about a relationship between a learning technologist and the work that they're undertaking, how they're getting feedback on its effectiveness and how they are judging the effectiveness of that work. So there's very broad readings of these terms, which there's lots of examples about now in the guidance. I'll also just say, one of the great things about achieving recognition as a fellow is once you have it, it's yours forever. So there is no annual fee once you've got your award.
I do like that, yes.
Okay, are there any final questions for Abby? No? All right, can we all show a bit of appreciation? That was great, Abby. Thanks very much. You said yesterday, like, is it got to be reasonably casual? I didn't expect it to be this casual, but yes. Thanks again.
A pleasure, absolute pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Abby.